speaking from Boston. I serve on the Economics Commission of the Communist Party USA. And with us, by the way, is my wife and comrade and teacher of 3 weeks plus 50 years. So, um, for 2 decades, comrades in the Communist Party in Cuba, in Vietnam, in China, and Arizona have invited me in part to help identify changes in the world political economy and their implications, and mainly focused on identifying and addressing weaknesses that made possible the greatest defeats in working class history. And this is, above all, the counter revolutions that swept 12 states where capitalist rule had been overthrown, above all, the Soviet Union. And the aim is to avoid repeats and move on to victories. Uh, my main motivation in doing this are short work weeks and long paid vacations, but no need to advertise that. Um, since the pandemic hit the United States, it has been an absolutely terrifying period, not least for youth. Um, really extraordinary economic and public health meltdown. But essentially, what the pandemic has done is to burst one bubble after another, and to topple one domino after another, and long ways to go. And good to remember, um, essentially, that uh, revolutions and liberation um, um, arise not so much because of a promise of a new social system, but because of failures of the old system. And what a spectacular failure we're seeing now, um, uh, on 1,000 fronts: socially, environmentally, economically, the lack of jobs, the poverty, one after another. Um, and again, the Russian Revolution, which created all of our parties, emerged out of failures of the old system. Major crisis 1900, 1907, which led to World War One, the greatest, the worst war that humanity had experienced until then. Um, and the massive capitalist failure that was the Great Depression and World War II opened the path for several more revolutions, all of them, by the way, led by communist parties. And the victories ranged from Albania and Yugoslavia to Vietnam, Korea, and above all, China. Um, and it's not evident on the surface, but it's perhaps surprising development is that in the past 15 years, our side in the global class struggle, the workers' side, has actually gained strength, uh, while capitalism has weakened. And provided that this pandemic doesn't lead to a disintegration, above all, of China, but of any of the states formed by socialist revolutions, it's likely that this relative strengthening of the working class side and weakening of world capitalism, not least of the United States, will accelerate. So let me tell you a little bit about me, because it does link in with China. I was born in war in Palestine 74 years ago, just about 95% of the Palestinians in the city I was born in, my family included, were driven out of Palestine in May 1948. This was one of three ethnic cleansings that were necessary to form the Israeli state. Um, we fled to Gaza. I'm an escapee from Gaza. From Gaza, we made it into Egypt, in part in time for the Suez Canal War of 1956. We were driven out of Egypt uh, uh, to Lebanon in time for civil war there in 1958. Um, we somehow then made it to the United States, and compared to the poverty of Gaza or Egypt, really thought we had landed in the land of milk and money. Um, and within weeks of arriving uh, in the United States, uh, I'm just starting to learn English. I somehow got the message that Teamsters equals gangsters. That the largest union in the United States was out to rob me. So something I'll never forget. I'm a little kid again, taken by the seeming wealth in the United States compared to what I had come from. Um, I was at an intersection, and uh, this tractor trailer stops at a red light, and I'm convinced that the driver will jump out of his cab and going to rob me. So where did that come from? So what was going on was the ruling class and its state and media were on a drive to weaken, if not bust, this union that potentially could shut down the United States. Um, so it wasn't long before the sweetest sight on a picket line was to see a Teamster tractor trailer drive up, um, um, to give us support. So, but essentially, the antagonism that got communicated to me again, such a short period after I arrived here, represented the antagonism of the exploiters to an organization of the working class. Uh, is this organization, the Teamsters, flawed? It sure is, but it's an organization of the workers, and the exploiters were and continue to try to do what they can to weaken and, if possible, break it. And they're certainly to try to use this pandemic to accelerate this. Um, so, um, in consideration, unions are not built to lead the revolution. Um, that's the job of a communist party. Um, Unions of necessity include all workers, advanced and backward, uh, conscious and not so conscious. Um, we do want and we need to work, so unions support the revolution, not block it. But we cannot expect a union to lead a revolution. That's the task of the Communist Party. Um, so this is where, in part, we get to China. In some ways, states formed by socialist revolutions are like unions risen to state power atop a great upsurge that broke the power of the bosses, above all, their state and and body of armed men, to use the term from Engels. In Russia, that revolution we can date to the day. The transfer of power took place November 7th, 1917. In China, October 1, 1949. So imagine the Teamsters Union, uh, flaws and all, but a labor organization now risen to state power in control of an entire economy, and not just the Union Treasury, and with an army. So that was the Soviet Union. That's the Cuban state. That's the Chinese state. In other words, a state after a socialist revolution uh, is comparable to a union risen to state power. Um, and the antagonism of the United States to a Soviet Union before it fell, or to a Chinese state, is like the antagonism of the US government towards the Teamsters Union, except on steroids. So, in any event, in early 2000, uh, somewhat to my surprise, I received an unsolicited invitation to speak at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. I knew nothing about China, just about other than what I just described. Then thought I was being invited by academics. The invitation was triggered by a column, economics column I had in the People's World, refuting Nobel economics prize winners about the real source of the seeming stability and wealth of in the United States, the seeming stability of U.S. GDP, which is not the same as the real economy. Um, and it was not academics that had invited me. It turned out to be high leaders of the CPC, not the top leadership, but high leaders. Uh, but in general, the leaders of China were in part confused by the seeming stability and wealth of the United States, and not least by the fall of the Soviet Union. Uh, a, a superficial application of Marxism, you'd expect the U.S. would have gotten weaker and the Soviet Union would have gotten stronger, but the Soviet Union fell and uh, while the U.S. seemed stable and got stronger, seemingly. So uh, less than 2 years later, I was invited to make a major presentation on factors in China, on factors in the fall of the Soviet Union. And one that I mentioned was that the unions in the Soviet Union, one weakness, the unions were not capable of defending workers against their own state if necessary, barring a sentence from Lenin. Um, and I stand by that, but the sentence was incomplete. It should have gone on. And unions were excluded from developing and implementing state policy. Should have been one of the parties. And that's a major weakness in China as well. So, which means that unions should be part of essentially making the best out of a bad situation. Even a mighty China, even a mighty Soviet Union before it fell, all it could do is to make the best out of a bad situation. If the masses, if the unions, if the workers are excluded from making, from developing policy, if this is just left to the leadership, even if the leaders make the very best choices, at the end of the day, we're still left the with a bad situation. And if we exclude essentially the unions and the mass organizations, the equality organizations, equality for women, equality for nationalities, and so on. Well, at the end of the day, even if the leaders make the very best choices, we're left with a bad situation, and the masses will blame the leadership and possibly turn against that leadership and uh, possibly bring down the state. So, so um, uh, just to give you another um sense of what was unfolding in China already as of 2002, a leader of a Communist Party of China explained very simply Workers of a world unite. The first step is communist parties of a world unite. My first reaction was, why didn't I think of that first? But hey, uh, she hit it on the head. It's such an astonishing uh, uh, guidance coming from that. In 2011, 9 years later, she came to the U.S. for I convene or helped organize periodic U.S.-China labor meetings. She came to the U.S. She learned English to add a word to her explanation, which was consciously. Workers of a world unite. First step is communist parties of a world unite consciously. Something very powerful. I I love summaries like that, and Marxism is very good at that. And there's an extraordinary amount of work behind what she raised. So, and I'm still very much in touch with her. So, to give you a sense, in 2000, by 2004, less than 4 years after arriving, after my first visit to China, I had gained enough confidence to make a formal proposal to the Communist Party of China, with the help in particular of Scott Marshall, backed by the party on the whole. But this was for the Chinese state to challenge Walmart management. There were several reasons behind picking Walmart. One, Walmart uh, was just one store in Rogers, Arkansas in the early 1960s. By the 1980s, it was the world's largest corporation and seemed to violate the laws of monopoly of Marxism that Marxism had put together. And thanks to the work of Victor Perlo, I was able to trace Walmart is essentially just a subcontractor for the U.S. ruling class. That's who really created Walmart. Um, Sometimes said that the Walton family, extremely reactionary, is the richest family in the United States, but in reality, uh, 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 much richer families, which control the state apparatus, was is who really created Walmart, and they were using it very consciously to weaken labor worldwide, including China. And in any event, what followed was actually fascinating. A year and a half of discussion that went to the very top leadership of China, including its state council. And this was organized by the comrade, the leader who first invited me. And the decision went to challenge not only Walmart management, but the management of all Fortune 500 corporations in China. And in I was told about this in late 2005, a year and a half after that, after I made the proposal, and a few months later, the first 17 stores uh, at Walmart stores in China were unionized from below, um, with midnight meetings and secret meetings before Walmart management caved in. And from there, it went. All Fortune 500 corporations were unionized in China, and that's. But with Walmart, that's the first time that uh, Walmart workers were unionized. What also followed also was fascinating, is that the. Oh, I should add, the unions in China at Walmart were unionized by the Communist Party, not by the trade unions. The trade unions in China were still under instruction, instruction that their task was to help with economic development of China. But essentially, my hosts, Communist Party, with the okay of the top leadership of the trade unions in Beijing, but not the help of the local unions where the stores were, but essentially the Communist Party is who organized the unions at Walmart. Um, in any event, what followed was also fascinating is then cooperation developed between the old China Federation of Trade Unions and unions that were involved in organizing, for example, our Walmart, um, warehouse workers, um, low wage workers here in the United States. And Thanksgiving 6, 7 years ago, um, these unions organized actions, including uh, this is like on Black Friday, um, that closed down some WalMarts, closed down warehouses, closed down a variety of low wage locations, McDonald's and others. And what was very interesting is that Walmart management, normally any worker at Walmart who dared to do that would be immediately fired. Um, but Walmart management's reaction was muted. The reason was that they knew about the cooperation between the unions in China and unions here, and were fearful. They still had hopes that uh, not completely gone, that China would be an area of major profitability and growth. Um, but that cooperation essentially, some of my hosts also then, that cooperation was largely with change to win unions, which included retail, wholesale, um, the Teamsters, and others. But kind of fascinating, and again, you see where the interests of the working class are the same, whether it's China or the United States. You got just the taste of that. In some ways, really, the Communist Party of China, and in particular my host, had tasted blood. They were victorious against Walmart. Again, first time that Walmart workers had ever been successfully unionized. Um, so, um, um, okay, um, so really, I should wrap up. Um, to summarize, China is like a union risen to state power, flaws and all. Like a union in a capitalist country, the state is not meant to lead a revolution. That state, that's for the Communist Party. Mind you, the Communist Party is in leadership, but the state also includes uh, the uh, hundreds of millions of non-workers. They're peasants, but they're also business owners, uh, largely small, but some of them huge. Um, uh, like in a union in a capitalist country, we want the state to help with the goal of advancing human liberation, not to be a block to that. And there's this extraordinary drama unfolding in um, uh, within China and really worldwide. And one of the things that I learned as a Palestinian is that the world is very changeable. It can change for the worse very quickly, but it's very changeable, and with preparation, it can change for the better. And our actions, and specifically those of communist parties, and can make an immense difference. And I would like to close by pointing out the communist parties of the world, with so many defeats in recent decades, with so many errors and problems. The communist parties of the world, uh, these are the ones found at the SolidNet meetings, the annual international meetings of communist and workers' parties. The communist parties of the world between them have 103.5 million members. The comrade from China who was at our convention last June in Chicago is who provided me with that figure. He studies CPs. And in turn, the labor unions that are associated, that look to our parties for leadership, have a combined membership of approximately 415 million members. Uh, in 1978, uh, we visited a coal miner in England, and one of the things he uh, pointed out is if we just learn to spit together, we could drown the capitalist. Except he didn't use such a polite term as capitalist. Um, again, it gives you a sense that there was something so powerful about the uh, Russian Revolution, reinforced by subsequent revolutions, above all China's, that we have an extraordinary world movement, and that our actions and initiatives and efforts can really help change the world for the better. So, I've spoken enough. Thank you so much.